The street was quiet. Too quiet for a Sunday night in Brentwood. No screams. No alarms. No warning. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Just flashing red and blue lights bouncing off million-dollar hedges and manicured stone walls, slicing through the calm like something violent had already happened long before police arrived. Let me ask you something right now. How does a legendary Hollywood family, worth millions, protected by privacy, fame, and influence, end in a blood-soaked crime scene inside their own estate? And more chilling than that, how does the story point inward? Because according to police reports, leaked statements, and accounts now circulating behind the scenes, the person accused of doing the unthinkable wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a burglar. It wasn't some shadow slipping in from the dark. It was their son, Rob Reiner, 78. Michelle Singer Reiner, 70. Found stabbed to death inside their $13.5 million Brentwood home. And within hours, their 32-year-old son Nick Reiner was in custody. That alone is enough to stop the world for a moment. But what allegedly came next is what has shaken even seasoned investigators. Because there is one sentence. Just 9 words. Unconfirmed. Unreleased. Unrecorded. A sentence that, if real, changes the entire meaning of this case. I was paid to do this. Before we go any further, let's slow this down. Because nothing about this case is simple. Nothing about it is settled. And nothing about what you're about to hear has been tested in a courtroom. An arrest is not a conviction. An allegation is not a truth. A leak is not evidence. But when powerful families collide with sudden violence, secrecy often grows where clarity should be. And in those gaps, questions multiply. That's why this story matters now. Not because of gossip. Not because of headlines. But because of what happens when the public rushes to judgment while crucial facts remain hidden. So tonight, we're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to walk you through what's known, what's alleged, what contradicts itself, and what no one seems willing to explain. And by the end, you may realize the most dangerous part of this story isn't the violence itself. It's how quickly a narrative can harden before the truth has a chance to breathe. The official timeline begins on a quiet Sunday evening. Police received a call reporting a disturbance at the Reiner residence. When officers arrived, they entered a home that showed no signs of forced entry. No broken doors. No shattered windows. No obvious struggle visible from the outside. Inside, they discovered Rob and Michelle Reiner deceased from multiple stab wounds. This wasn't a random act. This wasn't hurried. The brutality suggested intimacy, proximity, rage, or desperation. And almost immediately, investigators began asking the question that no family ever wants asked. Who had access? Because access is everything in cases like this. The Reiners lived in a gated estate. Security cameras. Privacy walls. A lifestyle designed to keep danger out. But one person didn't need to break in. Nick Reiner lived on the property. Not inside the main house, according to reports, but in a guest house on the estate. Close enough to come and go. Separate enough to live his own life. Near, but not fully inside the family orbit. And here's where the story takes its first unsettling turn. According to early police accounts, it was the Reiner's daughter, Romy Reiner, 27, who discovered the bodies. Imagine that moment. Walking into a home you've known your entire life. Calling out to parents who don't answer. Stepping into silence that suddenly feels wrong. What do you say in that moment? What do you tell police when your world collapses in seconds? According to reports, Romy told authorities something that would echo through the investigation. She allegedly mentioned a dangerous family member. Someone who should be a suspect. Let that sink in. In the immediate aftermath of unimaginable trauma, her mind went to someone close. Was that intuition? Fear? Prior knowledge? Or something said in panic that took on a life of its own? Because once that seed was planted, the investigation moved fast. Too fast, some would later argue. Nick Reiner was arrested that same night. No public disclosure of physical evidence. No released interrogation footage. No official statement about a confession. Just an arrest. 2 charges of first-degree murder. And a media firestorm that filled the silence with certainty. Headlines exploded. A son accused of killing his famous parents. A Hollywood tragedy turned horror story. A narrative that wrote itself before most facts were known. And yet, behind closed doors, the story may have been far less straightforward. Because arrests don't happen in a vacuum. They're built on probable cause, yes, but also on interpretation, on pressure, on what investigators believe they can prove, not just what they suspect. And this is where the case becomes murky, because somewhere between that arrest and the hours that followed, reports began to surface of something said during questioning, something not included in official filings, something not read aloud in court, something whispered, not recorded, an alleged statement that Nick Reiner claimed he had been paid. Paid by whom? For what exactly? And why would such a claim, if it existed, not immediately redefine the investigation? That question alone should make you pause. Because if someone truly said, "I was paid to do this," investigators wouldn't stop at the person holding the knife. They'd follow the money. They'd ask who benefits, who stands to gain, who might want two people silenced permanently. Unless, of course, the statement itself is disputed, unless it was misheard, misinterpreted, or leaked out of context to serve another purpose entirely. And that's where we need to be careful. There is no official confirmation that such a confession exists. No audio, no transcript, no verified source willing to go on record. Only reports, anonymous claims, and a sentence that refuses to disappear, which raises another uncomfortable question. If the statement isn't real, why hasn't it been clearly denied? And if it is real, why hasn't it been acknowledged? Silence can mean many things. It can mean investigators are protecting a case. It can mean legal strategy. Or it can mean uncertainty. And uncertainty is dangerous when the public is watching. Because once a story settles into a simple shape, it becomes nearly impossible to reshape it later. Son kills parents. Motive assumed. Case closed in the court of public opinion. But reality rarely obeys headlines, especially in cases involving wealth, inheritance, family fractures, and power. And make no mistake, money is never far from the center of stories like this. An estate worth millions, assets, trusts, wills, relationships strained over years, not days. But money alone doesn't explain violence this personal. Which brings us back to Nick Reiner himself. Who was he really? A troubled son living in the shadow of a famous father? A man struggling financially while surrounded by wealth? A convenient suspect? Or something far more complicated? Because people are rarely just villains or victims. They are messy, contradictory, capable of both harm and vulnerability. And when pressure hits, when family dynamics fracture, when expectations collapse, the truth can twist into something unrecognizable. That's why this story isn't about rushing to conclusions. It's about slowing down. About asking why certain details were emphasized while others disappeared. Why some voices were amplified and others went silent. And why, in one of the most high-profile family tragedies in recent memory, so much remains officially unsaid. Over the next sections, we're going to peel this story apart layer by layer. We'll reconstruct the night everything ended. We'll examine Nick Reiner's life away from the headlines. We'll look closely at the words that framed him as a suspect before any evidence was publicly shown. We'll follow the money, the relationships, the contradictions, and we'll ask the question no one wants to ask out loud. What if the story we think we know is incomplete? Because sometimes the most important truth isn't hidden by lies. It's buried under assumptions. And as we move forward, remember this. Everything you're about to hear exists in the space between allegation and proof, between grief and guilt, between suspicion and certainty. And that space is where the real story lives. Because before anyone can understand the alleged confession, or the motive, or the meaning behind that chilling sentence, we need to go back to the final hours, back to the quiet house, back to the moment when nothing seemed wrong. Because what happened that night didn't begin with violence. It began with silence. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The house didn't scream. That's the detail that keeps resurfacing. No neighbors reported shouting. No frantic calls in the early hours. No sudden chaos spilling into the street. Just a calm Brentwood night, the kind that feels insulated from reality. Palm trees barely moving. Lights glowing softly behind tall hedges. The illusion of safety holding strong until it shattered from the inside. So let me ask you this. If something violent happens in a place built to keep danger out, what does that say about where the danger came from? The official timeline begins on a Sunday evening, but timelines are tricky things. They look clean on paper and messy in real life. They bend depending on who's telling the story and when. What we know, according to initial reports, is that police were called to the Reiner estate after concerns were raised inside the home. Officers arrived expecting uncertainty. What they found was finality. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were dead. Multiple stab wounds. Inside their own home. With no sign of forced entry. Those three facts alone immediately narrowed the universe of possibilities. Because crimes like this don't usually involve strangers wandering in off the street. Not in a gated estate. Not without alarms or broken doors. Not without someone noticing. Which means investigators had to ask a question no family ever wants to confront. Who belonged there? The Reiner estate wasn't just a house. It was a compound designed for privacy. High walls. Controlled access. Security measures meant to protect one of Hollywood's most recognizable names. This wasn't vulnerability. This was insulation. And yet, someone crossed the threshold. Police moved through the rooms carefully, documenting what they could without yet knowing what would matter most. Blood patterns. Locations. The positioning of bodies. The quietness of it all. Because silence at a crime scene can be louder than noise. There were no signs of a struggle that spilled through the house. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. Whatever happened, it happened quickly, or at least contained. That detail would haunt investigators later. Contained violence suggests familiarity. It suggests proximity, trust, or access without resistance. And access became the central theme of the night. Who had keys? Who knew the layout? Who could come and go without setting off alarms? Very quickly, attention turned inward. According to reports, the Reiner's daughter, Romy, was the one who discovered the bodies. There is no public transcript of her initial statements, but multiple accounts suggest she was in shock, devastated, and struggling to process what she was seeing. Think about that moment. You enter a space that has always meant safety. You call out to people who have always answered. And suddenly the silence feels wrong. Your brain tries to reject what your eyes are seeing. In moments like that, words come out raw, unfiltered, sometimes prophetic, sometimes misleading. According to police sources cited in media coverage, Romy allegedly told officers about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. Those words would echo through the investigation. Because once spoken, they reframed everything. Investigators now weren't just looking at a crime scene. They were looking at a family fracture. And one name sat uncomfortably close to the center of that fracture. Nick Reiner, Rob and Michelle's 32-year-old son. Nick wasn't living inside the main house, according to reports. He lived in a guest house on the property, close enough to be present, separate enough to maintain distance. That arrangement may sound mundane, but symbolically, it mattered. Living on the estate meant access. Living separately meant independence or distance, depending on how you interpret it. And interpretation drives investigations as much as evidence does. Police learned quickly that Nick had been on the property that day. There was no immediate suggestion that he had fled. No car chase. No manhunt. Instead, what followed was swift and decisive. Nick Reiner was arrested that same night. Let that sink in. Within hours of discovering the bodies, police had identified, questioned, and taken a son into custody for the alleged murder of his parents. No public explanation of what evidence prompted that speed. No release of forensic findings. No detailed affidavit outlining motive or method. Just an arrest. 2 counts of first-degree murder. The speed alone raised questions. Because in cases involving family violence, investigations often take time. They involve careful reconstruction, especially when emotions run high and statements can be unreliable. So why move so fast? Some argue it suggests strong evidence. Others argue it suggests strong pressure. Because when a case involves a famous name, every hour without answers becomes a liability. Media scrutiny intensifies. Public speculation grows. And in that environment, certainty becomes tempting. But certainty can be dangerous. Nick was taken into custody quietly. No dramatic standoff. No resistance reported. No public outcry from him at the moment of arrest. And here's something that rarely gets enough attention. Silence during arrest can mean many things. Shock, fear, confusion, or the realization that nothing you say will matter once a story has already formed. As the news broke, headlines hardened almost instantly. A son accused of killing his parents. A shocking Hollywood tragedy. A narrative so stark it felt self-explanatory. But behind the headlines, investigators were still piecing together the night. What time exactly did the violence occur? Who saw whom last? What movements could be verified? Because time matters. If something happened earlier than believed, it changes everything. If something happened later, it changes it again. And according to early leaks, timelines were not as clear as the public was led to believe. Neighbors didn't report noise. Security systems didn't trigger alarms. There was no indication of an intruder fleeing, which means whatever happened didn't announce itself. It stayed inside the walls. That brings us to the crime scene itself. Multiple stab wounds suggest intensity, not hesitation, not accident. But intensity doesn't always mean rage. It can mean panic, desperation, or even instruction. And that's a disturbing thought, but an important one. Because crimes committed under direction look different from crimes committed impulsively. They're often cleaner, more focused, less chaotic. We don't yet know which applies here. What we do know is that police did not publicly disclose the weapon used. They did not release details about where each victim was found. And they did not confirm whether Nick had injuries consistent with the struggle. Those absences matter. Because when information is withheld, it's either because it's sensitive or because it complicates the story. And then there's the interrogation. This is where the night stretches into something darker. Nick Reiner was questioned. How long? Under what conditions? And with which legal representation remains unclear. No video has been released. No audio made public. No official transcript acknowledged. And yet, within days, reports began to surface suggesting something extraordinary had been said during questioning. Something that didn't fit the narrative of a simple family crime. An alleged claim that he had been paid. Paid implies another party. Paid implies planning. Paid implies motive beyond personal grievance. And if such a statement existed, it would have immediately widened the investigation. Unless it was dismissed. Unless it was unclear. Unless it didn't fit what investigators already believed. We need to be careful here. There is no confirmed confession on record. There is no verified source publicly standing behind the claim. But the persistence of the allegation itself is telling. Because rumors don't survive this long unless someone keeps feeding them oxygen. Which raises a troubling possibility. What if the night didn't end with the arrests? What if the real battle began afterward? Between narratives. Between interpretations. Between what happened and what could be proven. Because once a suspect is arrested, momentum builds. Resources funnel in one direction. Alternate theories quietly lose support. Contradictions get labeled distractions. And in a case like this, involving a powerful family and a horrifying outcome, the desire for closure can overshadow the need for caution. Think about how quickly the story solidified. A dangerous son. A tragic end. A family destroyed from within. It's clean. It's horrifying. And it's easy to digest. But reality is rarely clean. Especially when money, inheritance, long-standing tensions, and private struggles sit beneath the surface. The night everything ended wasn't just about violence. It was about access, about silence, about words spoken in shock that may have shaped everything that followed. And as we move forward, one thing becomes clear. This case didn't hinge on a single moment. It hinged on a sequence of decisions made under pressure. Decisions about who to believe, what to emphasize, and how fast to act. Because sometimes, the most important evidence isn't what's found at the scene. It's what gets overlooked in the rush to explain it. And next, we need to step away from the night itself. Away from police lights and locked doors. Because to understand how suspicion landed where it did, we need to understand the person at the center of it. Not as a headline, not as a suspect, but as a human being with a past that may hold more answers than the crime scene ever could. Because before that night, Nick Reiner was already living a separate story. And what we uncover there may explain why investigators looked at him first, and why they may never have looked anywhere else. But what came next would complicate everything, and force us to ask whether the truth was being uncovered or constructed. He was the son everyone thought they knew. But was anyone really looking closely? Nick Reiner had a life that seemed ordinary at first glance. A 32-year-old man living on a Hollywood estate, surrounded by wealth, fame, and influence. He attended elite schools, rubbed elbows with celebrities, and had the family name that opens doors most people could only dream of. On the surface, it was a life many would envy. But appearances are dangerous. They are often the opposite of reality. Because Nick's life was full of contradictions. He lived on the Brentwood estate, but not in the main house. That's a detail often overlooked, but it matters. He had proximity to his parents, yes, but he also had a distance, a separation that allowed privacy, independence, or perhaps isolation. Was it self-imposed? Was it encouraged? Or was it a reflection of tension inside the family? We may never know for sure. Nick had been described by friends and acquaintances as intelligent, charismatic, even charming. He could be funny, quick-witted, and personable. But close friends also hinted at volatility, mood swings, sudden bursts of frustration, a tendency to push boundaries, sometimes too far. Sound familiar? Perhaps. Because many tragedies in wealthy families involve small cracks in relationships that, over time, widen into chasms. Now consider this. Nick's life was also shaped by expectations. His father, Rob Reiner, a respected filmmaker and public figure, had created a legacy of achievement, responsibility, and visibility. Expectations aren't inherently damaging, but when combined with personal struggles, financial dependence, or perceived slights, they can create pressure that simmers beneath the surface. Nick's mother, Michelle, was known as a stabilizing influence, kind, protective, and involved. Her presence may have provided comfort, but also, possibly, oversight that felt constraining to someone seeking autonomy. The combination of proximity, privilege, and expectation sets the stage for tension. And tension can explode in ways no one predicts. Financially, Nick's situation was complicated. Public reporting suggests he lived a comfortable life on the estate, but sources hint at debts, pressures, and reliance on family support. Was he dependent on allowances, inheritance expectations, or direct financial support? Reports are contradictory. Some portray him as independent and self-sufficient. Others depict someone struggling quietly, perhaps resentful, perhaps insecure. And resentment, however quiet, is a dangerous element in any story involving family wealth. It's also important to note that Nick's personal relationships were private. Social media reveals little. Friends and acquaintances have been careful with statements. There is a sense that much of what the public assumes about him is built from fragments, occasional sightings, hearsay, and conjecture. This is crucial because it leaves a space, a vacuum, for interpretation. And in a story like this, vacuums get filled quickly. Imagine this. You're a detective, a journalist, or even a neighbor. You see a young man living on a property where a tragedy occurred. He has access. He has proximity. He has a complex history. And someone close to the victims, Romy Reiner, has pointed toward him as a person of interest. Wouldn't your mind start forming theories immediately? Exactly. And that's what happened. But Nick's personality complicates the narrative. He wasn't just a son. He was a private individual, sometimes secretive, often contradictory, outwardly confident, inwardly pressured, socially adept, personally struggling, privileged, yet facing expectations that weighed heavily. There's a psychological dimension here that is often lost in media coverage. Many people reduce suspects to a single dimension, guilt or innocence, good or bad. But humans are layered, complex, capable of contradictory behaviors in the same day, the same hour. And understanding those layers is critical if we hope to see the story beyond the surface. Some reports suggest Nick had a pattern of avoiding direct confrontation with his parents, choosing instead to retreat to the guest house. Others hint at past disagreements, some trivial, some significant. Family dynamics rarely operate in absolutes, and what seems minor on the outside may hold major emotional weight on the inside. There were also rumors of friendships and associations that concerned investigators, though little is confirmed. Social circles can provide both support and influence, and in some cases, connections that appear innocent can introduce risk or suspicion. All of this builds the context of Nick Reiner as both a public son and a private stranger, a person everyone thought they knew, but whose internal world was largely hidden. Which brings us to a critical point: isolation. Isolation doesn't mean physical distance alone. It's about disconnection from understanding, empathy, or oversight. Nick lived near his parents, but may have been emotionally removed. That separation can generate frustration, anger, and, in extreme circumstances, resentment strong enough to drive irrational decisions. But we must remember, all of this is context, not accusation. It helps explain, but not justify, behavior. It provides insight, not certainty. And that's precisely what makes this case so confounding. Because investigators and the public alike are trying to reconcile the son they think they know with the son the situation forced them to suspect. Imagine if you were in that house, trying to make sense of conflicting impressions. The charming son, the volatile son, the independent son, the one who had access, the one accused. All of it converging in a violent, tragic moment. And then consider the timing. According to sources, the bodies were discovered by Romy, the daughter. Her account, her instinct, her fear pointed to Nick. She reportedly used the word dangerous. She suggested suspicion. And her observations set the immediate direction for investigators. Think about that weight. A daughter, traumatized, pointing toward a family member. How much does that influence law enforcement decisions in the heat of the moment? The answer, a lot. Which is why Nick's personal life becomes essential to understand. Because when pressure mounts, past patterns, access, personality traits, and social context all get amplified. And there is a layer here that often goes unnoticed in public reporting. Nick's relative invisibility in the media before this incident. Unlike his father, he was not a public figure. Unlike other family members, he was not constantly in the spotlight. And that invisibility created space for assumptions to grow, gaps to be filled, and narratives to harden. People filled in the blanks with speculation. Some thought he was resentful. Others believed he was struggling financially. Some suggested mental health issues. Some hinted at darker possibilities. And in high-profile cases, speculation can quickly become perceived reality. Which brings us to the paradox. Nick Reiner was known to the world, yet unknown in critical ways. Public son, private stranger. This duality is crucial for the story that follows because it sets the stage for understanding motive, perception, and alleged confessions. As the investigation unfolded, this duality became a recurring theme. Who Nick appeared to be versus who he actually was. And that gap, that space between perception and reality, is where most of the tension in this case exists. Because when a person exists in that space, every action, every word, every movement can be interpreted multiple ways. And the interpretation that wins out first often dictates the narrative. Before the alleged confession, before the headlines, before the arrests, Nick was living in this gray zone. A son with proximity, access, and complex internal life. A man capable of many things, none of which can be assumed from appearance alone. And it's in that gray zone where the story begins to twist. Because once the bodies were discovered, once the daughter suggested suspicion, and once the police moved, Nick's private life collided violently with the public narrative. And in that collision, we begin to see how a single moment, a single allegation, can overshadow years of context, nuance, and complexity. The night everything ended wasn't just about what happened in the house. It was about what everyone believed had happened. And as we move to the next chapter, we'll examine Romy's discovery of the bodies, what she saw, what she said, and how a single observation may have shaped the direction of the investigation in ways no one fully anticipated. Because sometimes the first witness changes everything. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. A Sunday, quiet, familiar, safe. For Romy Reiner, 27, daughter of Rob and Michelle, nothing prepared her for the scene she would soon encounter. The house she had grown up in, the space filled with memories, laughter, ordinary family chaos, had been transformed into a place of horror. Imagine walking through a doorway and feeling instantly that something is wrong. That silence, the absence of sound you normally take for granted, suddenly screams at you. That's what Romy reportedly experienced. According to multiple sources, she was the one who discovered the bodies. Not a neighbor, not law enforcement. Her father, mother, and the home she had known intimately were suddenly the center of an unthinkable tragedy. It's hard to overstate the psychological impact of that moment. Shock, disbelief, terror, confusion. These are words that barely capture the mental whirlwind a person experiences when faced with such trauma. But then she reportedly did something remarkable. She tried to make sense of it in real time. Romy allegedly informed police about a dangerous family member who should be a suspect. Those words, seemingly simple, carried enormous weight. Pause for a moment. Consider what that entails. A young woman, shaken to her core, identifies someone she knows intimately as potentially responsible for the deaths of her own parents. That's a statement no one can ignore, not law enforcement, not investigators, not even the public. And yet, there's complexity here that the headlines rarely explore. First, the nature of the observation. Was it fear, intuition, prior knowledge, or a reaction to something she had witnessed or heard previously? Second, the impact. When law enforcement receives that kind of information, particularly in a high-profile case, their response is inevitably shaped by it. It isn't just a lead. It becomes a lens through which they interpret all subsequent evidence. And third, the timing. The speed with which authorities acted after her statements suggests that her words were pivotal. Within hours, the investigation's focus shifted sharply, and soon, her brother Nick Reiner would be arrested. Think about that chain of events. Bodies discovered. A family member points toward another. Arrest follows swiftly. Media frenzy erupts. Public narrative hardens. All before the full picture of what happened could be reconstructed. Romy's 911 call reportedly described both the scene and her concerns. She allegedly mentioned the potential danger posed by someone familiar, someone within the family circle. That phrase, dangerous family member, is haunting. It implies history, familiarity, knowledge of behavior, perhaps even a premonition of what could happen. And that's where we encounter the first major contradiction in the case narrative. If Nick Reiner was already living on the property, if he was known to be there, why wasn't he immediately questioned before the arrest? Or was he? Sources suggest law enforcement acted quickly, but details about the timeline remain unclear. The uncertainty is significant. Because in investigations involving family dynamics, timing, statements, and perceptions often outweigh physical evidence in shaping initial action. Let's step back. Romy's perspective matters not only for the immediate investigation, but also for how the public interprets the events. Her credibility, her emotional state, and the words she chose all contribute to the story. And yet, here's another layer. Trauma affects memory. Panic affects perception. Emotional statements can be both truthful and distorted simultaneously. In other words, what she reported may have been real in her mind, but not necessarily a literal reflection of events. This tension between perception and reality is central to understanding the unfolding drama. After her discovery, police were faced with critical questions. Who had access? Who could have committed this act without being detected? Who had motive, opportunity, and capability? And those questions inevitably led investigators back to Nick. Proximity, history, opportunity, all elements aligning in a way that made him the focus of scrutiny. But we have to consider the human element. Romy was a daughter in trauma, a witness to her own family's devastation. Her statements, while influential, were made in a moment of crisis. What she remembered, what she inferred, and what she expressed were all filtered through shock and grief. Which means every piece of information, every detail, every word from that night had to be weighed carefully. The police report, though limited in public disclosure, suggests that her observations directly influenced the trajectory of the investigation. Her description of a dangerous family member was taken seriously, and for good reason. The implication of internal threat is dramatically different from random violence. Think about it. A home designed for safety, a family within its walls. And yet the danger allegedly came from inside. That alone is a psychological shift for investigators, the media, and the public. And it sets up one of the most difficult aspects of this case: motive. In crimes where the perpetrator is suspected to be a family member, the lines between intention, accident, resentment, and coercion blur. Motive is rarely clear-cut. Opportunity is often circumstantial, and evidence may be interpreted through the lens of assumptions rather than facts. Romy's statements were just one part of this complex puzzle. But because she was the first on the scene, her perspective became the anchor. Everything else would orbit around her observations. Now, consider the stakes. The Reiners are a prominent family. Rob Reiner is a public figure, a filmmaker with decades of recognition. Michelle Singer Reiner had her own public presence. The death of both parents in the same night, in a home designed for safety, is extraordinary. The public's interest exploded almost immediately. Social media, news networks, and online forums began speculating. The narrative formed quickly: a son accused, a daughter's discovery, a family torn apart. And yet, here's the paradox. While the story became public knowledge in hours, much of the factual detail remained obscure. The public saw a headline. They didn't see the nuance. They didn't see Romy's emotional turmoil, her interpretation of danger, or the complexity of her statements. That's significant because once a narrative solidifies, it's extremely hard to shift, which is why the next piece of the puzzle, the arrest, feels inevitable in hindsight, but was anything but straightforward in real time. Nick Reiner's arrest reportedly happened the same night the bodies were discovered. According to sources, he was taken into custody quickly, without incident. The speed of action reflects the urgency investigators felt, but also raises questions. Was the focus too narrow? Was there pressure to act before all evidence was fully analyzed? These questions are crucial because in family-related crimes, initial impressions often dominate the trajectory of an investigation. What's believed in the first 24 hours frequently guides all subsequent decisions. And here's another troubling point. The alleged confession that would later surface, that he was paid to do this, has never been officially released. But its potential existence hangs over every action taken after Romy's discovery. If true, it reframes everything. If false or misinterpreted, it becomes a dangerous distortion. And Romy's initial statements indirectly contributed to that trajectory because they focused attention squarely on Nick. It's a delicate web of cause and effect. Observation influences investigation. Investigation shapes narrative. Narrative informs perception. Perception, in turn, can influence public opinion, media coverage, and legal strategy. And the cycle continues. So, as we move forward, understand this. Romy's discovery and her words were pivotal. But they are not the whole story. They are a catalyst, a spark in a room full of combustible material. The next chapter takes us into the arrest itself. Because once Nick Reiner was taken into custody, the stakes shifted entirely. The story moved from tragedy to legal crisis, from grief to suspicion, from observation to allegation. And what happened behind closed doors in that arrest, and shortly thereafter, would shape every headline, every rumor, every narrative going forward. The night was far from over. By the time police had secured the Reiner estate, taken statements, and processed the initial shock, one person had become the center of every theory, every suspicion, and every headline: Nick Reiner. Imagine being a 32-year-old man, living on the property where your parents were just found murdered, and suddenly seeing flashing lights not as decoration, but as a warning. Officers moving with precision, their focus on you. No prior warning. No chance to prepare. Arrested in the same night that your family was violently taken from you. Reports suggest the arrest was swift, procedural, and surprisingly calm. No dramatic confrontation. No violent resistance. Yet the speed and decisiveness of law enforcement created immediate questions in the minds of neighbors, the media, and the public. How could investigators be so certain so quickly? The answer lies in the convergence of factors: proximity, opportunity, prior observations, Romy's initial statements, access to the guest house, and the intense pressure of acting in a high-profile case with potential media fallout. But what was publicly unknown, and remains unclear, are the details of the evidence that justified the arrest. What did law enforcement actually know at that moment? Were there fingerprints, DNA, surveillance footage? Or was the arrest based on circumstantial factors combined with Romy's observations? Some law enforcement insiders suggest the latter. And if true, this raises critical questions about investigative bias, narrative shaping, and the influence of first impressions. Because in any criminal investigation, especially one involving family, timing is everything. The first decisions, who to interview, who to detain, which leads to prioritize, can define the entire course of the case. Once Nick was arrested, the lens through which investigators viewed the rest of the evidence was irrevocably focused. Consider the psychological impact as well. Arrested in such circumstances, Nick reportedly had no opportunity to fully process what had happened. He was suddenly the suspect in the deaths of the people who raised him. The stress, the fear, the grief, all compressed into a single, terrifying moment. And yet, this is precisely when the narrative begins to harden. Media outlets, hungry for facts and drama, immediately framed the story as son arrested for parents' murder. Social media speculation exploded. Headlines required clarity, but the reality was anything but clear. There were gaps, contradictions, unanswered questions. And those gaps were quickly filled by assumption, rumor, and sometimes outright fabrication. Meanwhile, within the estate itself, the investigation continued. Officers combed the property, documented every detail, and tried to reconstruct the final hours of Rob and Michelle Reiner. But the rapid focus on Nick created a cognitive shortcut for investigators. The suspect is known, the scene is contained. Now everything can be explained through the lens of the son's alleged involvement. This is critical to understand. Investigators are human. They rely on patterns. They seek closure. And when a high-profile case presents an apparent suspect with access, motive, and opportunity, confirmation bias can creep in, even unintentionally. Every ambiguous detail suddenly seems to support the theory. Every contradiction is overlooked or rationalized, which brings us to the nature of the arrest itself. Nick was taken into custody with formal charges of 2 counts of first-degree murder. First degree implies premeditation, planning, deliberate intent. It's the most serious accusation the legal system can levy. Yet at the time of arrest, no official confession had been made public. No evidence had been detailed. The community, the media, and even friends and acquaintances were left to grapple with the shocking image of the accused without the context that might explain how law enforcement reached that point. The lack of transparency created space for speculation. Was this truly a premeditated act, or a tragic accident framed by circumstance? Was the alleged confession, later reported in whispers and leaks, genuine, coerced, or misinterpreted? Did investigators truly have the proof needed to justify first-degree murder charges, or were they acting on an abundance of caution given the high-profile nature of the case? These questions underline the tension between the judicial process and the court of public opinion. In cases like this, perception often outruns reality. The world sees a son arrested for the murder of his parents. Behind the scenes, investigators are still gathering evidence, verifying timelines, and interpreting complex family dynamics. And as Nick sat in custody, his own reality was a mix of fear, confusion, and grief. Imagine the psychological weight. Accused of an unthinkable act, your parents gone, your sister's statements looming, and the world already forming a narrative about your guilt. The stress is unimaginable, and it complicates every statement, every move, every interaction with law enforcement. Compounding the tension is the fact that at this stage, reports began to circulate about the alleged words he had spoken during questioning. The phrase, "I was paid to do this," began to surface, though no official confirmation existed. The implications are staggering. If true, the case suddenly involves another party, potential conspiracy, or financial manipulation. If false, the claim threatens to irreparably damage Nick's reputation and influence public perception before a trial could ever occur. And this is where the uncertainty becomes almost unbearable. Because the arrest itself, swift and seemingly definitive, created a narrative. And once a narrative solidifies in the public mind, reality has difficulty catching up. Headlines report, "Son arrested for parents' murder." Social media debates guilt and motive. Friends and family, often in shock themselves, are forced to respond to a story that has already taken on a life of its own. Meanwhile, investigators continue to work quietly, carefully, collecting evidence, analyzing forensic results, and trying to piece together timelines that remain murky. Every detail matters. Every contradiction matters. Every delay or omission can be misinterpreted. And yet, from the outside, it all seems simple: a son, a tragic death, an arrest. The truth, as we will see, is far more complicated. The arrest without answers is not the end of the story, it's the beginning. It sets the stage for interrogation, alleged confessions, and a cascade of revelations that will challenge assumptions and force the public to question what is real and what is narrative. Because sometimes the most important events happen after the arrest. And what came next, behind the closed doors of an interrogation room, would shift the entire focus of the investigation and introduce one of the most disturbing claims in the case. The room was small, bare walls, a single table, 2 chairs, and a fluorescent light humming overhead. No cameras, no audience, no immediate witnesses beyond the officers and attorneys present. Just a space designed to isolate, observe, and extract truth, or what investigators believe to be the truth. Nick Reiner sat there, a man whose world had already collapsed. His parents were dead. His sister had identified him as potentially dangerous, and the public was already constructing a narrative that labeled him guilty before he had spoken a word. Imagine that pressure. Imagine the mental strain of sitting in a room where every question feels like a probe into your life, your past, your motivations. The fear, the grief, the confusion, it all converges in a single moment. And every word you utter can be interpreted as evidence. Every pause can be a confession. Every defensive gesture can be analyzed for intent. Reports indicate that investigators approached the interrogation with intensity. They were searching for answers, for clarity, for any statement that could explain the brutal violence inside the Reiner estate. But the process was complicated. Nick was not only grieving but also aware, at some level, of the magnitude of what was happening. This is where the alleged confession comes into play. I was paid to do this. 9 words. Simple. Allegedly devastating. Potentially explosive. No official recording exists. No transcript has been released. And yet, multiple sources have hinted at its existence. The implications are staggering. If true, it implies involvement of a third party. Someone external to the immediate family who allegedly influenced, coerced, or directed Nick's actions. It shifts the case from a domestic tragedy to a potentially orchestrated act with layers of motive and financial or personal manipulation. If false, it demonstrates how quickly information can leak, distort, and dominate public perception. A single unverified statement can define a narrative before any concrete evidence is even examined. Think about the psychology of the situation. In a high-pressure interrogation, suspects experience extreme stress. Cognitive overload, emotional trauma, and fear of consequences can lead to contradictory statements. Confessions can be misremembered, misreported, or even coerced, intentionally or unintentionally. Investigators, too, are human. They bring expectations, biases, and interpretations into the room. They are under pressure to act decisively, particularly in a case with immense media attention. The words they hear, the body language they interpret, can shape the narrative in profound ways. And this is exactly what seems to have happened. Allegedly, Nick's statement about being paid was reported by anonymous sources. No official confirmation, yet the claim persisted. The media picked it up, amplifying its impact. Headlines hinted at conspiracy. Social media speculation exploded. And the public, hungry for clarity in a story that was anything but clear, accepted fragments as facts. The interrogation, therefore, became more than a legal procedure. It became a pivotal moment in the construction of the case's narrative. But here's the paradox. The alleged statement raises questions the investigation had yet to answer. Who paid him? Why? Was it coercion, manipulation, or something else entirely? Investigators reportedly began following these questions quietly. Records suggest a review of financial transactions, personal communications, and external connections. And yet, none of this was made public at the time. Meanwhile, Nick's demeanor reportedly shifted throughout the interrogation. Calm at moments, distressed at others. Defensive, cooperative, withdrawn, articulate, sometimes within minutes. This variability is normal under extreme stress, but often misinterpreted outside the room. Consider the stakes. This was not just an interrogation about a crime scene. It was an interrogation about family, about trust, about access, and about allegations that could define a lifetime. Every reaction mattered. Every response could be analyzed. Every pause could be spun as evidence. And then there is the role of the legal counsel. Nick's attorneys were reportedly present, attempting to ensure he did not make statements that could be misinterpreted. Their presence, however, does not eliminate the psychological pressure of the moment. It is nearly impossible to fully shield a suspect from the weight of grief, accusation, and procedural stress simultaneously. In the hours that followed, investigators reportedly attempted to verify the alleged payment claim. Financial records, bank statements, and potential outside connections were examined. Whether these efforts produced leads, confirmed suspicion, or generated dead ends has not been disclosed publicly. But the allegation itself, regardless of verification, had already altered the perception of the case. Because when the public hears that a suspect claims to have been paid, the mind immediately jumps to conspiracy, external manipulation, and premeditation. The crime stops being about domestic tragedy and becomes something darker, more calculated, and more complex. And this is where retention of public interest is often highest. People are drawn to the narrative gap, the what if, that challenges their assumptions. The possibility that the story is bigger, more twisted, more disturbing than first believed. That's why media coverage persisted, rumors proliferated, and speculation became nearly indistinguishable from reporting. Yet investigators reportedly remained cautious. Statements were unverified, leads were being followed, and the investigation was still in its earliest stages. This is critical. For every claim, allegation, or rumor that surfaced, there was a counterpoint, a question, a detail unaccounted for. And in a case as emotionally charged as this, the balance between speculation and evidence is precarious. Imagine being an investigator at that moment. A famous family, brutal deaths, a son in custody, a sister pointing suspicion, an alleged confession that could implicate unknown third parties, public scrutiny, media pressure, and the knowledge that any misstep could irreversibly influence perception and potential legal outcomes. The interrogation room, small and unremarkable, became the epicenter of all this tension. It was not just about extracting truth. It was about managing chaos, parsing grief, analyzing statements, and anticipating every possible legal and public consequence. And yet, even with all this, critical pieces remained unknown. The exact nature of the alleged payment, the potential identity of any outside influence, the veracity of the statement itself, which brings us to the most unsettling part. In cases like this, the line between confession and rumor can blur. Once something is reported, it gains life independently of verification. A single sentence, unconfirmed, can dominate narrative, shape investigation, and alter public perception indefinitely. And that sentence, the alleged "I was paid to do this," would continue to cast a shadow over every subsequent development. Because in a story like this, one statement, true or false, can define the difference between motive, misinterpretation, and public judgment. And as we transition into the next chapter, we will examine the implications of that alleged confession, explore the potential financial and relational context behind it, and begin to follow the threads that may connect motive, opportunity, and alleged third-party involvement. Because what came next would introduce a level of complexity that no one had anticipated, and would raise questions that remain unresolved today. The words were simple, but their potential consequences were anything but. "I was paid to do this." 9 words, allegedly spoken by Nick Reiner during his interrogation. A phrase that, if true, would transform the entire investigation from a domestic tragedy to a story of conspiracy, manipulation, and calculated intent. Yet here's the critical point. No official recording exists. No verified transcript. The statement survives only through leaks, anonymous sources, and media speculation. And in a case this high-profile, that ambiguity is itself explosive. Let's examine what this claim implies. First, if Nick truly said he had been paid, it raises an immediate question. By whom? Was it an external party with a personal vendetta? Someone seeking financial gain? A friend, acquaintance, or associate manipulating him for their own purposes? Or could it have been a figure with knowledge of the Reiner estate's assets, trusts, or inheritance? The possibilities are both unsettling and numerous. Second, the statement suggests premeditation. Being paid implies planning, negotiation, and intent. If true, this could indicate that the act was not spontaneous, not the result of an emotional breakdown, but directed, purposeful, and motivated by factors beyond mere personal conflict. And yet, there are alternate interpretations. Could the statement have been misheard, misinterpreted, or taken out of context? High-stress interrogations can lead to miscommunication. Emotional states, fatigue, and fear can distort what is said. Sometimes, suspects speak hypothetically, sarcastically, or even ironically, but words are reported literally. Which brings us to the third implication, public perception. Once media outlets began reporting the alleged statement, speculation ran rampant. Social media exploded with theories. Headlines suggested conspiracy. Viewers and readers formed immediate judgments. And because the statement is unverified, it exists in a liminal space between truth and rumor, a perfect storm for narrative escalation. Now consider the financial context. The Reiner estate was reportedly worth $13.5 million. Trusts, assets, and inheritances were likely structured with long-term planning. In families of such wealth, disputes over money are rarely straightforward. Allegations of manipulation, coercion, or incentivized behavior become both plausible and sensational. Even if the alleged payment never occurred, the perception of financial motive is enough to drive public speculation, influence media coverage, and shape legal strategy. There's also a relational aspect to consider. Family dynamics are inherently complex. Proximity and familiarity, history and grudges, love and resentment, all intersect in ways outsiders rarely fully understand. The claim of being paid suggests an external actor, yet the internal family relationships must also be examined. Could frustration, entitlement, or perceived neglect have intersected with influence from outside? Could personal grievances have been exploited by someone else? Investigators reportedly began following multiple threads: financial records, phone communications, social connections. Every potential link, however tenuous, could provide evidence to either confirm or refute the alleged confession. And yet, the investigation remained highly confidential, with very little information released to the public. This secrecy fueled further speculation. The alleged confession didn't just implicate Nick. It created a narrative that someone outside the immediate family might have orchestrated the tragedy. That possibility alone transformed the story into a psychological and financial thriller, attracting intense scrutiny from media, public, and investigators alike. But there's another dimension: the legal implications. Even if investigators could verify the payment claim, establishing culpability of a third party is complicated. It requires clear evidence, corroboration, and the ability to prove coercion or conspiracy. Otherwise, the alleged confession risks being dismissed, while the suspect remains the central figure. And if the statement is unverified, then it becomes a weapon in public opinion. It shapes perception without evidence. It influences the way friends, neighbors, and even jurors might view Nick Reiner. And in high-profile cases, perception can become almost as powerful as reality. Now let's look at the human side. Nick, as a suspect, was reportedly already under immense emotional strain. Grief, confusion, isolation, and the knowledge that the public narrative was forming against him would all affect his mental state. An allegation that he had been paid adds another layer of psychological pressure. Whether true or false, the weight of implication is real. Consider also the timing. The statement allegedly surfaced shortly after the arrest, at a point when the investigation was still gathering evidence. Its early emergence amplified suspicion and narrowed investigative focus. The alleged confession may have created a tunnel vision effect, focusing investigators and the public on Nick as the sole actor while potentially overlooking other avenues. And here's a critical point. In investigations involving high-profile families, the first narrative often dominates. Once the story frames a suspect in a particular light, every subsequent detail is filtered through that lens. Confirmations reinforce the narrative. Contradictions are rationalized or minimized. This is why the alleged confession is so consequential. It not only influences legal proceedings, but also shapes the media, public, and historical record of events. It exists in a space where reality and perception intersect. And in that space, assumptions can become almost indistinguishable from fact. Furthermore, the financial angle cannot be understated. If someone indeed paid Nick, what was the motive? Extortion? Revenge? Gain from inheritance? Access to assets? All are plausible, yet unverified. Each potential scenario alters the investigation's trajectory and the way the public interprets the events. Even more, the alleged confession raises uncomfortable questions about morality, agency, and responsibility. Was Nick a willing participant, a manipulated pawn, or a misunderstood figure reacting under extreme pressure? The ambiguity is what fuels the drama. Because the story of a family tragedy is inherently compelling, but the addition of potential external influence transforms it into a layered puzzle, a case study in human psychology, wealth, and manipulation. And this is exactly where public fascination intensifies. People are drawn to gaps, contradictions, and unanswered questions. The alleged confession provides all three. It creates a narrative tension that cannot be resolved without further information. Information that may never be fully disclosed. And as the investigation continued, the alleged statement reportedly guided multiple lines of inquiry, financial analysis, examination of communications, and scrutiny of any potential third-party involvement. Yet each of these avenues remained largely invisible to the public, leaving speculation to dominate. In essence, the alleged confession, verified or not, became the fulcrum upon which the case pivoted. And the uncertainty surrounding it created a narrative that demanded answers, but could provide none. Which brings us to the central question moving forward. If Nick Reiner truly said he was paid, who would have orchestrated such a plan, and why? And if he did not, how did such a claim take hold, and what consequences does it have for public perception, media coverage, and investigative focus? The implications are staggering.